the historical average in polling error terms for, going back to the late 90s is about 5 percentage points.
If you look at how the polls did this year compared to sort of historical average, New Jersey was really bad. It was about a 9-point average error compared to only about 4 historically. That makes these New Jersey polls the worst in our database, and that goes back to about 2001.
Do you have any hypothesis on why?
Recently, of course, the polls have underestimated Republicans in the past 3 presidential elections.
Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Skelly, Chief Elections Analyst here at DDHQ. Polls, and more polls. They are such a huge focus of election season and what we do here at Decision Desk HQ and what other election observers out there are doing, and with good reason. These snapshots in time, they provide a really useful look about what the electorate's thinking. So beyond knowing like who's in the lead between 2 candidates, we can also find out what issues are driving the electorate, what they're thinking about, what they think is important, how the attitudes toward the parties might be affecting things, the parties and their leaders, and a million other things that polls can ask people about when it comes to public opinion. Still, an individual poll is subject to potential complications, sort of most notably sampling error, and also little things about a pollster's methodology. Different pollsters do things somewhat differently, and that can help produce somewhat different results, even if they were starting from the same sample. So all those things can affect a poll's result. And sometimes, you can run into a situation where multiple pollsters are maybe running into the same issue. You can think about the 2016 election or the 2024 election, even the 2020 election. To some extent, polls, by varying extents, underestimating Donald Trump's performance, particularly in states that maybe matched sort of the demographics of people who supported him more often. The Midwest in particular in 2016, famously, polls definitely undershot Donald Trump's performance. So you can run into sort of systematic issues. So how well the polls perform on an individual basis and as a whole is something that we're really interested in. So with that in mind, and thinking about the 2025 election that just happened and thinking ahead to the 2026 midterms, the Silver Bulletin, founded by my former 538 boss, Nate Silver, just released an analysis of how the polls performed in the 2025 elections, which will play into how they rate pollsters moving forward. And so we're really excited to welcome on Eli McKown-Dawson, the senior elections analyst at the Silver Bulletin, who was the author of that analysis. Eli develops polling averages, forecasts, other data-driven analysis of what's going on in U.S. politics. And so he's very much the person to talk to as well, because he actually has a background having done design work and polling question development for YouGov. And additionally, I'm also very excited to be welcomed by Scott Tranter, my current boss, Decision Desk HQ's Director of Data Science. He is a jack of all trades who helps make it possible for DDHQ to gather election results and other data and put that out into the universe. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining me as well. And so with that, I will welcome both of you to the podcast.
Hello, thank you.
Huge fan of the Pollster ratings. I've probably been reading them ever since Nate started doing them. I probably got into them like you did, Eli.
I've always been reading them ever since Nate started doing them, so it's still odd that I'm working on them now.
Yeah, it must be fun, right?
It is fun, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say, or go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, no, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, when you started doing it this cycle and you were looking at all the different pollsters from 2025 and putting together some of the methodology and things like that, what are some of the things you're like, all right, I've been reading this for 10 years. I've got some opinions. Look, we all got opinions. What's kind of your mark or your take on the evaluation of the pollsters this year and how you did it?
So in terms of, usually we save these sort of retrospective things for after bigger elections, a presidential race or the midterms. I thought it would be kind of enjoyable to do one after 2025 as well, just because, again, with the polls underestimating Donald Trump in 2024, it was sort of our first look at something that is kind of constantly in the news that we're using to measure Trump's approval rating and increasingly now the generic ballot and that sort of thing. So I thought it would be, fun to try and see how they did in the off cycle.
So I guess that leads us to sort of the next question, which is, looking at the 2025 elections, particularly the gubernatorial races, New Jersey and Virginia, that were very high profile, but also some special elections in the U.S. House of Representatives. How did the polls do? What was your top line takeaway?
I mean, it wasn't a great year for the polls. For context, yeah, pretty much all the polls we added from 2025 are from the gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia. A couple House special elections. For our ratings, we're not looking at down ballot polls of things like lieutenant governor or attorney general. Um, and really, it was not excellent in either Virginia or New Jersey. Now, of course, if you follow polls, you've probably heard someone say this a million times. You always expect some amount of polling error. They're never going to be exactly perfect, even a poll that was conducted the day before the election. Uh, However, if you look at how the polls did this year compared to sort of the historical average in Virginia, polling error was about 6 points compared to 4.5 points historically. And then New Jersey was really bad. It was about a 9 point average error compared to only about 4 historically. That makes these New Jersey polls the worst in our database, and that goes back to about 2001. So, in terms of error, really not a spectacular year for the polls. Bias is the other kind of big measure we use. That basically is looking at how whether polls are systematically underestimating Democrats or Republicans. In this case, pretty much all the polls were biased toward Republicans, so they underestimated how well Democrats would do. Especially in New Jersey, you looked at the polling averages. It looked like Mikey Sherrill was going to win, but it was a somewhat close race. Didn't end up being particularly close in actuality. So sort of a middling year for the polls overall.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth sort of thinking, how does this fit into maybe what we've seen in recent elections, or going back to sort of the full data set. I brought up on screen here for people who are watching uh, the table you had in your article about sort of error in 2025 in Virginia and New Jersey and gubernatorial elections overall, and also House elections. And you can see like the historical average in polling error terms for going back to the late 90s is about 5 percentage points, a little over 5 percentage points in error, just average error in gubernatorial elections. So like, to your point, you're going to expect some error. It's just the error was about 7 points across the two gubernatorial races, and particularly high in New Jersey. So from the perspective of, okay, where does this fit into historical error? It was a down year.
Yeah,
Poll.
for sure. And I mean, you can see the same thing if you look at the bias. I mean, the average historical bias in gubernatorial races is only about a little less than a point toward Democrats, and it was almost 7 points toward Republicans this past cycle.
Do you have any hypothesis on why? Like any thoughts or opinions on why that was?
Why the bias was so high? So
Yeah.
yes, as always, there are multiple potential reasons why. One thing that a few people have sort of looked at with these polls is, I guess, okay, to get into this, we'd have to talk a little bit about what polling bias has looked like over the past sort of few cycles. So if you look back, as Jeffrey was just saying, through the database, to the 90s, polling bias tends to fluctuate year to year. And if you average over all those cycles, it's pretty down the middle. But recently, of course, the polls have underestimated Republicans in the past 3 presidential elections. So 2016, 2020, 2024, Trump was always, to varying degrees, underestimated. The interesting sort of pattern is that you haven't seen that same sort of thing in recent midterm cycles. So in 2022 and in 2018, bias was a lot smaller. And in 2018, the polls actually, underestimated Democrats a little bit. So that's sort of the context going into these sort of off-cycle races that we would usually group with the midterms. Why is that? Again, pollsters have different theories. One kind of potential explanation has to do with, what we call low propensity voters. So voters who maybe, will come and vote in a presidential election, but wouldn't be as likely to turn out in the midterm, and certainly not, an off-cycle election or a special election, that kind of thing. This is not a new problem, but polls have kind of always had more trouble getting those sorts of voters into their samples, which, I mean, It's fairly intuitive if you're the type of person who isn't going to go out and vote, isn't engaged in politics. I don't know why you would respond to a political poll. It'd be a little odd, but increasingly Republicans and Trump specifically are doing very well with this. These sorts of voters seem particularly engaged by Trump and want to go turn out and vote for him. And so in presidential years, those types of voters, they go to the polls and they vote. But if they're not showing up enough in the polls, you're going to end up with kind of a Republican underestimation problem. Even things like weighting, where pollsters sort of, adjust their sample to look like the population they're interested in on things like race or gender or education, can't really fix that issue fully. Of course, that's kind of not as much of a problem in midterms because a lot of those low propensity voters simply aren't going to show up in the polls at all. And so you're not getting that same issue. Where that could have created a little problem in a year like 2025 is when pollsters weight to something called recalled vote choice. So what that means is you might ask your sample, okay, who did you vote for in the 2024 presidential election? And then you weight your sample so you have the correct percentage of Trump voters and Harris voters. There's kind of a long historical debate among pollsters about whether you should do this or not. It used to not be very common at all. It's getting increasingly common for a variety of reasons. It can be very helpful. It can also have various drawbacks. Like, for example, people sometimes aren't very good at remembering who they voted for. Or you have some percentage of people who will just tell you they voted for the winner, even if they actually didn't. That is a pretty well-documented thing that people sometimes do. But the problem maybe in 2025 is that waiting to recall vote choice often pushes your results toward the election you're waiting toward, which is sort of obvious. And so kind of the default thing that a lot of pollsters ended up doing in 2025 was weighting their results to either the 2024 presidential election or the 2021 gubernatorial election. And so State Navigate did an interesting analysis of this in Virginia. And the problem with that approach potentially last year is that 2024 and 2021 were relatively, red electorates. Trump obviously didn't win Virginia in 2024, but he did well nationwide. And Republicans did win the governorship in 2021 in Virginia. And so those were, fairly Republican electorates compared to what you might expect from Virginia when a Republican is in the White House, because historically those have been kind of bluer electorates. And so what State Navigate found, which is sort of what we see here as well, is that pollsters who ended up doing that were less accurate than pollsters who sort of modeled a bluer electorate for 2025 and weighted toward that. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
No. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to get a little nerdy with you a little bit. My personal take, and I'd be curious if you may disagree or agree, is people who wait to 2021 or basically a question, they're I guess I'm out of the business. They're lazy, right? Like they can't manage a voter file. They don't know what PPS means. They have no idea what stratified sample means. They have no idea how to, really create a sample frame. And it's harder, but it's relatively easy to just tack on question at the end about, or somewhere in the middle about who you voted for, and then wait on the back end. You can do that in Excel and Microsoft Word. I think it's lazy. I think it's easy to go after. I think a lot of the private polling, the stuff that people pay a lot of money for that doesn't end up on CNN, they do this method. Is that your take as well? Or like if you were designing a poll for Virginia, how would you do it?
Yes, I think I think it can definitely be dangerous to wait to recall vote choice. I mean, it looks like in 2024, it might have helped some pollsters, but also at past elections, there's often evidence that it would have made things worse. And certainly, I think the simple way you're talking about is probably not what people really should be doing, because there are there are more sophisticated ways to do it, whether it's using a voter file or whether you have some sort of panel like a lot of polling firms have now. And so they ask the question the day after the election, and then they have that going forward for people, and so people don't have the sort of memory problem. I mean, yeah, I think if I was designing a poll for Virginia, obviously I have the benefit of hindsight right now. But yeah, if I was getting my results back and doing the weighting and it looked like the electorate was just as Republican as it was in 2021, that'd be a big red flag to me. Looking at the data, I'm just it's this is the part where the weird sort of science of polling meets the art of polling, and you have to in some ways, if your results are looking unintuitive like that, that might be a bad sign.
I mean, look, you know certain things. You know that there is a tendency for the party in the White House to not do as well in these elections in this kind of situation. So if you are finding something like that where the electorate is looking very similar to a a more favorable year for Republicans in this particular case, or if you were looking in 2014 or something and we're finding things somewhat better for Democrats or closer to 2012, you'd be like, something seems a little off here. And so it's like it is informed by, electoral history, so science in a way. But to your point, there is like sort of the art of like, okay, well, what you have to gauge as a pollster, I think, in a way that may be more difficult now than ever because it's harder to reach people. Getting a sample to begin with is challenging, more challenging perhaps than ever. But making sure that sort of your I don't know, your guideposts for makes sense. They pass the smell test.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's definitely gotten harder. The sort of modeling side of polling is just getting more and more important every year. I mean, I obviously wasn't around in the industry in the 80s and 90s, but you talk to pollsters who were working back then, and it was, yep, we did the poll for CBS and we fielded it and we got it back. Maybe we did a little bit of cosmetic weighting to make things look nice, and then we put it out, and that just doesn't work anymore. Um,
I was gonna say, how might you guys handle? I do know they do this on the private side. And I used to do this on the private side. Used to tell clients like, look, this is what the horse race is at this turnout profile, and this is what the horse rate is with this turnout profile, right? Because especially if you're doing some of these higher sample ones, it's the Pollster version of we've got the base model, we got the deluxe model, and we've got this and that. There's a big debate, public polling, especially some of these media ones, if they start releasing, hey, this is the horse race, or this is the numbers with this turnout and versus that turnout. A, what's your opinion on that? And B, how would that change the pollster ratings into 2026?
so you do occasionally see a media like a public poll release a few different versions
Every once in a while, yeah. But
three likely voter models, and
yeah,
one of them shows Trump up by one of them shows Harris up by one, and it's like
yeah.
people tend not to like that at all.
No one likes it but us on this this podcast.
Personally, I don't have a problem with it because they'll all go into the average, and we'll sort of blend it together for what we use for our model. So I don't have a problem with it. I think it's interesting. I think it gets a little tougher if at the same time, though, if you are a media pollster, you do need to be able to put that poll out somewhere and say what it says. And so it is a little
Look, you need to have a chart on TV that's not too difficult to follow. This is realistic. It's truly a
it is. And so it's tough then to release too many different versions of a model, of a likely voter model, which is why I guess you probably see that split between public polls versus the private stuff. I mean, on our end, yeah, we you consistently you see differences between whether people are using likely voter screens and how those screens are being done. I mean, even if you look now at Trump approval polls, there's a big difference between, polls conducted among adults versus among, likely voters. And, we're going to start seeing that with the generic ballot more and more as pollsters now start to turn their likely voter models back on over the next few months as we start, getting closer to the midterms.
Side note on the generic ballot, it's months consternation in our Slack channel over here. Obviously, the generic ballot's one of those, it's a big input to people's forecast models. And over the last 50 years, it's been highly historic. But every time I see one of these generic ballot models come out, D+9, D+1, you get an Atlas Intel throwing an R+1 out there. I'm just seeing this generic ballot whip up and down. And I'm like, oh man, how is that going to, a razor thin house? That keeps me up at night. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of variation on.
I feel like there's more variance on generic ballot this cycle and probably the last cycle than I've seen, say, in the mid 2010s.
You know, in some ways that's nice because it means that people aren't hurting, which is sort of good. It's sort of nice for us in some ways. We'd sort of almost prefer that when you're using it for a model than it's everyone says D plus 2.5. Okay, that's great. That's what our model is going to say too. Okay. If so, interested. Slight spoilers. We may or may not be launching our generic ballot average this week as of this recording. It'll probably be out by the time people are watching this podcast. And yeah, I've been collecting those polls, looking back to the methodology and stuff, and I came across a whole old 538 article of Nate being like, we had to smooth the average more because it was moving around too much. So
I got to rebid. It sounds like me now.
Yes. So this has been a problem. Oh, yes. So certainly on our end, we do a lot more smoothing for our generic ballot average than we do for Trump approval because of this problem. Yeah.
Because the generic ballot moves 2 points. I mean, that's the difference between a Dem and a Republican House this October.
Yeah.
Which is another headache to explain. Is like, why did last week you think the Dems were going to win it, and then one Atlas Intel poll drops or one Verisight poll drops and it goes the other way?
Yeah, especially, I mean, we'll get to how our pollster ratings kind of feed into all this, but yeah, that's especially a problem with firms that are very highly rated because even more of that.
Sorry for the tangent. The generic ballot, I would be excited to read it or see it come out because, yeah, it's a problem that we're always going to have to consistently be solving.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to tie a bow on the recalled vote conversation with this, obviously, recalled vote, as you said, can kind of end up pushing the results of your poll a bit toward whatever election you're waiting to, and obviously you can do that in a simpler and more complicated way. But nonetheless, we did see in the 2024 cycle. I remember I wrote an article about this for 538. A lot of pollsters were using recalled vote because it was a way of at least making it a little less of a problem that there has been this struggle with reaching lower propensity voters who also happen to be a bit more favorable to Trump than voters would be otherwise. And so I guess the thing is, if people were doing that some for 2025, even though the electorates were going to look pretty differently, I am curious about your thoughts for 2026, and this is a potential issue, and how it might be playing into it, what people are thinking about with things like the generic ballot right now, or Trump's approval, or what have you, in terms of trying to interpret where public opinion is.
I mean, yeah, I think waiting to recall vote, like lots of other things, is a tool that can be used kind of well or not particularly well. And I think what could
you guys are nicer than me.
Well, because I think it can help sometimes, and it can be done in better ways or worse ways. But I think what would be bad is if pollsters in a year where maybe underestimating Republicans won't be such a big problem, kind of overlearn from 2024 and 2020, because this is less of a polling critique and more of kind of a media critique. But polling misses get a lot of headlines when A, they underestimate Republicans, and B, they happen in presidential years. The polls were not very good last year, but no one was writing about the polls dying or the polling is ruined, polling is over. So there's somewhat of a cost for pollsters to underestimate Republicans in a high profile election for, people, it's happened again. So, I think it would be bad if pollsters kind of over index on that and keep pushing things a little more Republican, maybe in a year where it's not going to look like that, because I think that could end up being.
You're fighting the last war essentially, and you run into danger of potentially doing that. Because here's the thing: like 2024 election, I think there's an argument to be made. You have the same candidates on the ballot until Joe Biden dropped out, but you had the same candidates on the ballot, or at least same Republican nominee. Same guy who, at the end of the day, President Donald Trump is what politics has sort of revolved around for the last, decade. And so in that sense, I think there's a better argument for using something like recalled vote when you have, this major figure involved in both the 2020 and 2024 elections. So if you're using 2020 vote as at least part of your methodology, like, I don't think that's a terrible idea in a 2024 presidential election environment.
No.
But I am a little more wary about using that outside that situation, because the electorate will look different. People's views do change. If you'd used 2012 vote in 2016 or something, that would have gone poorly.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. It definitely would have. Yeah, it's not an easy question. And I mean, I think you're right about the 2024 example. I think waiting to recalled vote worked a lot better for pollsters that cycle than it would have.
I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence.
Let me ask you guys a question. It's June of 2028. It's JD Vance versus Gavin Newsom, and you've got to run a poll for money. Are you using recall from 2024 or 2020? Are you using recall at all? And if you are, what year?
I feel like that almost depends on A, what sort of recall we're talking about, and B, what kind of poll I'm running. If it's, if I'm being like Nate Cohen and doing a phone poll with New York Times Siena versus something online, I feel like it's a very different ball game almost. I don't know. I know that's a bad answer, and I'm sorry.
No, I mean, the answer I take away is you're still sticking to it's a tool.
Yeah.
Asking recall is a tool that you would pull out in the appropriate situation.
Yes, I guess I would contrast it with something like waiting on educational attainment, which
Oh man, yeah, we could have
Which is supposed to solve everything, right?
yeah.
something that now is very common practice. Most people wait on education now.
But they might be rating on the wrong
They
education.
might be, yes.
In
Yes.
fact, a lot of them are, but yeah.
But what I'm saying is, I feel like usually I would default to yes, I would weight this poll on education. Whereas with recall vote, I think it's much more of needing to use it in specific situations and potentially doing some extra modeling on the back end to get a picture of the electorate that actually matches what you kind of expect it to be. I think that's how I differentiate those.
Yeah, and I know this is going to be a conversation both with the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential election because so many pollsters have turned to this in the last few years. And it will be, I mean, it's going to be, I think, a real legit question whether or not it runs into more problems without Trump being involved, having been involved in 3 straight presidential elections. And to your point about like people remembering their votes and Donald Trump is like he is the most polarizing figure of our time. People have very strong opinions about him. So to me, it's like people are more likely to remember their vote. Even lower propensity voters are more likely to remember their vote in a presidential election involving Donald Trump because he is such such a high profile and divisive figure all at the same time on a level that I don't know anyone else has quite attained.
Yeah, no, you make a good point there. After the 2024 election, I talked to some pollsters about kind of their takeaways and stuff. And there's, some debate about how much this current issue with underestimating Republicans is a Trump specific issue or not. That's sort of a somewhat open question. Is it going to be that in 2028 we're going to have a different nominee and it's not going to be a problem anymore, or is it going to continue? I mean, it might come down to something like who the next Republican sort of nominee is. If it's someone who sort of activates those same low propensity voters, we might continue down this same path. But if the party goes in some other direction, it could start to be less of an issue. And that is also an interesting,
Right, because party coalitions do shift over time. Even in the last few years, they have shifted in various ways. And so that's a real.
The Mitt Romney Republican is no longer a thing.
Yeah, a lot fewer of those.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before our eyes, like there's going to be minted PhDs 50 years from now looking at the Republican electorate between 2012 and 2024 and being like, okay, the Republicans went from pro-free trade, small government, less populism to Donald Trump just completely flipped the electorate in 2024. I mean, it's amazing to watch. I'm not a historian like Skelly is, but I mean, you almost have to go back, turn of the 20th century for that kind of switch over in voter electorate, things like we'd be talking about the Whig Party.
I mean, at the very least, you are talking about like sizable shift in parts of like a coalition that, the turn of the 20th century is not a bad comparison, like 1896, you get a bunch of sound money Democrats moving over to the Republicans here because they're like, oh, we don't like this silver exchange stuff with William Jennings, Bryan.
It's like Bitcoin all over again. But
yeah, Bitcoin, yes.
Yes,
Specie and crypto. They should
Put that in our comments and see what kind of it'll do the YouTube algorithm. Yeah.
Well, hey, I guess looking ahead now, Eli, I guess for people in thinking about Pollster ratings and knowing what the work the 538 did under Nate's leadership and now what Silver Bulletin's doing, I guess for people who are curious, like how does like the error in a 2025 poll play into a pollster's rating, and then how do the pollster's ratings play into your averages for things like the generic ballot and Trump's approval and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the simplest level, the point of pollster ratings is to try and use sort of the one objective measure we have of how accurate a poll is to get an estimate of the sort of quality of a pollster. Because obviously, for most things like Trump approval or issue polls, you can't compare those to any true value to see how well a poll has done. Here, we're using election results to see how well the polls have done. So we're not with the actual ratings themselves, the letter grades that we end up with, just using the sort of simple error we've been talking about here. Essentially what we're doing is comparing how much error you'd expect a poll to have based on the race it's polling, the sample size, how other pollsters have done in that sort of race, what you'd expect the error to be versus what the actual error of this poll ends up being. And so if it's bigger than you'd expect by some large amount, that is a negative signal. And if it's smaller, that's sort of positive. And so what these polls are doing is essentially from 2025, we've added these to the database of other polls we have from these pollsters and updated their ratings, accordingly. Now, obviously, this is an off-cycle election. This is only about 40 new polls, many fewer than in a midterm, let alone sort of a presidential year. So, pollsters are really having, one, maybe two polls added, maybe three for a couple. So we're not seeing massive shifts in the ratings, but there were some, interesting individual differences that we can talk about if you want. In terms of how these feed into our averages and forecasts, basically the point of an average is we're trying to take data from a bunch of different pollsters and combine it together to get a more accurate picture of public opinion. And it's useful there to know how accurate a pollster has been previously. So a pollster with a good rating will get sort of more weight when it's added to the average. So if we get something from, the Washington Post or New York Times Siena or Analyst Intel, it's going to get a lot of weight when it's added to our average. And it's going to move things more relative to a pollster with no rating or with sort of a worse historical accuracy.
Right. And so I guess actually I brought up here your best and worst pollsters of 2025. We don't have to like throw shade on people. Different pollsters have good and bad cycles. But I guess to your point, I think it's worth reminding people you looked at the final 21 days. So
Yes.
you're not grading pollsters on something they did 2 months ahead of the election,
No.
because obviously people are paying more attention by the time you get close to the election. And so also pollsters are more of them are polling unlikely voters. They're both all trying to figure out what the electorate is really going to look like on election day.
Yes.
And so the last 3 weeks, you got a better shot at doing that.
Yeah, we're not looking at polls from months before. It's pollsters' final poll or your final couple polls is what we're sort of including here.
Is it? And I'm pulling from like all it's the poll released a week before election day. Any poll? What's that cutoff?
It's a 21 days. If the median field
21
day
days,
is
okay.
within 21 days of.
So if and I should have looked at this before we got on the call, but like George Mason, weren't they like 15 days out? Or some of these polls were like 2 weeks out.
These are toward the back. Yes, some of these are actually
Yeah.
toward the back end of that 21-day cutoff.
And obviously you do, but like, let me be somewhat critical here. Like, is that fair to compare that poll to like, say, Navigate? They dropped one like 4 days out or something. They were close to the end, right? Like, I mean,
So yes, that is. I would say absolutely. When you're looking at the simple error, do keep that in mind. That factors into the actual ratings we end up with. So that advanced plus minus there. So
advanced plus one. Okay.
yeah. So in that advanced plus minus is the thing that translates into the letter grades. So all of that.
And that takes into account, I thought that took into account other things like methodology, but you're saying it has that time
Yeah,
factor.
because you're
Okay,
thinking
cool.
about what the expected error of the poll would be versus what it actually was, and part of that is when it was given.
Gotcha.
And so, I mean, if you want to go through this chart, yeah, State Navigate did very well in Virginia. They had 2 polls there. They did very, very well. I mean, they have a lot of expertise within that state, and so it makes sense. Zombie did well in New Jersey. YouGov had polls of both states and did very well. So, I mean, this wasn't a bad cycle for every pollster. Obviously, even in bad cycles, you have people who individually put out some pretty accurate stuff. Yeah, I don't know how deep we want to get into these, because again, it's only a couple.
It's okay. And in fact, maybe this is I know this is old now. I think I don't think this is the updated one, but I've just brought it up just so people can get an idea of sort of who tends to show up on this list, especially for a federal election cycle, an even year, 2024, 2026.
I think this is the new one. I think this is the updated version.
Oh, okay. Well, great. I wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure I had the right thing here. So, obviously there are a number of pollsters that have Marquette, Charles Franklin at Marquette University Law School, I think, is a very highly respected individual. Nick Cohn and the stuff, the New York Times and Siena College's partnership is very respected. I mean, there's a lot of names on here that you consistently see as people that I don't know have long histories, but then also some newer ones. And you mentioned Atlas Intel.
Yes.
Just I think they didn't have the greatest 2025 cycle, but it's one of those interesting things where a pollster can have a good cycle, but also a bad one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Atlas didn't have they were incredibly accurate 2024, kind of a poor 2025. Their letter grade is now an A, not an A+ after those couple of polls. But again, still quite a highly rated pollster. And yeah, again, you've seen the same thing with other big firms. New York Times has had its share of large misses in the past. And so, but yes, overall you see movement among these top pollsters, and you'll see new people pop up and stuff, but you do see a lot of consistency as well. Unless you have something, dramatic like Ann Selzer, of course, in 2024. That is
I was saying, I'm curious, have you guys ever thought about doing regional or state-specific pollster ratings? Like, take Data Orbital, for instance. George Califf, it's a long time, I've been talking to him a while, but he's around. But like Arizona is his thing.
Yeah.
That's what Data Orbital, if I looked at that, I bet of their 18 polls, I bet 15 of them are out of Arizona. On message, they're a Republican firm, so they do all the targeted stuff. Have you ever thought about like doing some of these that are specific to states? Because as you pointed out, some of these guys are better at certain states just because they do it a lot more.
Yeah, you're right. So I don't think we talked about doing ratings like this for specific states. I mean, we do for specific projects look at sort of historical polling error at the state level or for particular races in states. But I do think that would be sort of interesting, because I mean, it's a good point you've made that yes, you have these firms that are very knowledgeable about a specific state and know a lot about that state. So potentially it would be somewhat useful to know that for when they put out polls of those states versus other.
The only reason I bring it up, it's like, look, we're about to go to Nebraska, right? And like every once in a while with like Montana or North Dakota, polls, and like there's not a lot of public polls, but like there are, in my personal opinion, pollsters are like, I know who I would use in Nebraska. And it's not anyone in the top 10 here. And it's nothing against these top 10. It's just, one of those things.
No, absolutely. I think that is a good point, because you do, yeah, like I think this goes back to sort of what we were talking about at the earlier about the art side of polling, where if you had a lot of knowledge of a particular state and a particular electorate, you're able to, I mean, pre-2024, that's what people thought about Ann Selzer. She was, incredible which is, I mean, misses happen. And especially when you...
Statistically, they're going to happen, right?
What I was going to say is misses happen, especially when, like Selzer, they're not doing a lot of really heavy weighting, which large misses like that a lot more likely. Which is
even if we're doing heavy weighting misses. I mean, look, we're in the field of probabilities. You're going to miss some sometimes.
Yes.
I don't know. You got to lean into it as much as she did, but you're going to miss some.
Yeah. It's a tough balance.
Yeah, and I was sort of getting to thinking about what Scott was getting there, was talking about with sort of state-specific pollsters. W I guess the one challenge there with sort of establishing a pollster rating is that you if I guess what I actually really am trying to get at is here, there are certain states that get polled a lot because they're important in, like, a presidential election. They're a swing state. They're the they get a lot of focus. But then obviously those can change over time, and so the if it's a national pollster who's had a lot of experience polling, I don't know, Missouri used to be a swing state, right? And it is not definitely not been a swing state in national politics for a while now, but it was for a very long time. And I'm just thinking about sort of the map shifting and the expertise that develops. Like, obviously, there are certain things you're going to do regardless of where you're polling, but different states have some have party registration, some don't, which could affect how you're weighting. What's available in the voter file might differ. Some pollsters still don't use a voter file necessarily, but most do. I know now because it's been hard not to. So I guess it's just I guess it to me raises just it sort of maybe gets to the art and science thing, and so I guess actually where I want to segue here, because we've been talking for a while, I figure we can segue toward the close here. Is you wrote in your article, the maybe the good news here is that they've had the pollsters in terms of accuracy have had an easier time in when Trump is not on the ballot. But that your bearish case for polling accuracy is that this is all becoming a bit of a guessing game, and you're worried about overcompensating or undercompensating even for pollsters looking to wait their way out of trouble if they're struggling to get the sample they need and what have you. So, I guess I was curious if you had any sort of final thoughts on the state of polling as we kick off the year 2026 here and have a big election in about 11 months.
Yes, I don't want to be too negative in some ways because in some ways the polls have done okay in recent years. I mean, the midterms have been good on those benchmarks. In 2024, the polls underestimated Republicans, but actual error wasn't particularly high. It was lower than sort of the historical average. Um, I do think yes, polling is increasingly about these modeling decisions. And I mean, I say this as someone who works on polling averages and forecasts and stuff, and we make a lot of those decisions ourselves. And so I think you can have a good product like that, but certainly, yeah, we're increasingly in a world where you're getting data back that you simply could not really release in an unweighted, unmodeled kind of way, and it would make much sense at all. You have to do this sort of stuff now. And of course, that introduces a lot more sort of degrees of freedom for people to make good or bad decisions about how they're weighting the data, how they're constructing their likely voter model. And generally, pollsters are good at this stuff. I mean, these are people who are very experienced with this, and they have a you know a fair track record of being able to certainly learn from mistakes and update them over time. Um, but yes, I think it would be a mistake to, like you said, Jeffrey, fight the last battle all the time and be so worried about, okay, we really don't want another headline about how we underestimated Republicans without thinking a little more about whether that's really going to be the problem in 2026 as opposed to other things being the challenge this year. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
The last battle, I feel like that's what we're always doing. And at least the last, if you look at 16, 20, and 24, each battle's been different.
Yeah. No, it has.
If you're a pollster, let's just be real. The sample frame has been different.
Yeah.
The sample frame was different in 20 than it was in 16. And it wasn't on my bingo card, Trump winning the popular vote. And the fact
Me
that he won
neither.
the fact that he won the popular vote tells me the sample frame was wrong for pretty much every pollster, because you need to assume that
Yeah.
when you're creating a sample frame, which is fine. These are, like you said earlier, everyone's making guesses. This is where it's like, if anyone really took a polling class, they'd realize there's more art in it than science, and you have to, like you said, make reasoned decisions and
Yes.
explain them out.
Yeah, at this point there really is. It's not just about, okay, if we take a random sample and call a bunch of people, it'll come out nicely because it simply won't anymore.
Yep. Yeah. I think one of the thought experiments I like to say is, if I told you in the day after Labor Day 2024, I said, Eli, I'm not going to tell you who's going to win, but I'm going to tell you Trump's going to win the popular vote. And you get a one-time free pass mulligan to adjust the forecast based on that knowledge. You don't have to tell me, how much you'd move, but I think you'd probably move it greater chances for Trump. And if you were doing a poll sample or something like that of sample frame, you would adjust your sample frames. And I think most Republican and Democratic pollsters, at least those I talked to, if you would have asked them, you ask them like, hey, what's your sample frame? What are you thinking for turnout? What are you thinking for that? Everyone's thinking Donald Trump may, not getting close to winning the popular vote, or certainly not winning it. And so therefore it just cascades down to all the decisions you make for weighting and everything else, which it's fine. But that was the battle.
No, for sure. I was looking back at what our forecast had the popular vote at, actually, which is not the main point of the forecast, of course. I mean, we essentially had the Electoral College in our final run of that model at as really as close to 50-50 as you could get it. But yeah, we had our forecast for the popular vote was Harris winning it on 2 points. I mean, yeah, so it was
2016-ish, I mean,
Yeah.
Clinton won by about 2 points in 2016.
Yeah, that's a reasonable. If we were having a beer and you said, I'd be like, yeah, that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I'd have to look what ours was. I imagine ours was probably a little less than 2 points, but I bet we had Harris winning it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. One final question for you. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Let's imagine all the knowledge you have now, and your best friend is going to run for governor of Virginia or governor of New Jersey, and you're trying to tell him, hey, I'm not going to ask you to pick a pollster, but like pick a methodology. Be like, make sure when you hire a pollster to run for governor, they do this. What would your advice be?
I think, honestly, being multiple points I'd offer. I think what you were just talking about, for a statewide race, I'd say, pick a pollster who has a lot of experience in that state, who has a lot of knowledge of what the electorate looks like in that state, what elections tend to look like year to year in that state. Because I think you can have, national pollsters do very accurate state level polls, but I think having that sort of on the ground knowledge is I think almost increasingly useful, given how much modeling goes into this stuff now. It probably is. I would almost guess it's, again, I wasn't working in the industry in the 90s or something, but I would imagine it's harder now to be a national pollster and go to the states and do well, because you have to model the electorate in a way that you just didn't before. And that's a lot easier if you know things about the area you're working in.
Makes total sense. I always like asking. I mean, look, you get to look at this data all day. I wish I had more time for it, but it's kind of like the food critics, right? Like they get to try all the restaurants, and every once in a while you ask them, like, what's the one restaurant you'd eat at? And they always got the insightful answer. It's never the 9-star Michelin, what everyone saw on Instagram. It's always a little bit smarter. So it's good.
Well, hey, Eli, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much for coming on. We will have to do this again, obviously. Talking polls, talking forecasts, there's oodles to talk about. So again, I want to thank you for coming on. This has been Silver Bulletin senior election analyst Eli McKown-Dawson. You can check out stuff at natesilver.net. Is the link for Silver Bulletin, and all the analysis is there. You can find his recent article about the 2025 election results and how the polls did compared to them. Scott, thank you for joining us. This is Scott Tranter, head of
fun.
Yeah, for sure. This is head of data science at DDHQ, and I'm Jeffrey Skelly, the chief elections analyst at DDHQ. And thank you so much for listening, for watching, and I hope you all have a fabulous rest of your week.
Thank you for having me.